Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. I'm Amy Johnson Crow. This week we are going to talk about what are you missing in the 1850 to 1880 censuses. If you've been watching the Archives.com live streams, you might have seen some of our previous live streams talking about what you might be missing in other censuses, such as the video that we did on 1920 to 1940, and also 1900 and 1910. So you might be asking, well, what about 1890? What might I be missing in the 1890 census? Well, actually, you're going to be missing quite a lot in the 1890 census because unfortunately, it was mostly destroyed by fire. In fact, only 6,160 records survive. That's out of a population of almost 63 million people in the United States. So just a very, very, very small fragment of the 1890 census is still in existence. So today we're going to focus on the next set of census records before that, 1850 through 1880. Now the 1850 census marks a milestone in census records in the United States because it was the first U.S. census to list all household members by name. Now, the censuses before that, beginning in 1790, they listed only the head of household, and then everyone else in the head of household was just shown by a tick mark, by age, and by gender. So the 1850 census is a huge improvement for our family history research because now we're going to have everyone listed by name. So let's take a look at that 1850 census schedule. And up at the top, they used a great standardized form, and it would tell exactly what schedule it was. It would say the city or the township, the county, the state, and what date the census was actually taken. And you might have noticed here at the top where it says free inhabitants. And what that means is that these people listed on this page are not slaves. Slaves were considered property and were not listed by name in the 1850 census. Also, pay attention to the date that's listed. Even though the official census date for 1850 was the 1st of June, we notice that in this census for New Bedford in Bristol County, Massachusetts, was actually taken the 13th of August. And this might make a difference when you are looking at ages of infants. Sometimes you will see an infant and they're less than a year old. They were supposed to mark their age as a fraction. If they were 3 months old, they were supposed to be listed as 3/12. Well, that was supposed to be their age related to the official census date of June 1st. Now, they're not taking this census until August, so, which direction, were they following the directions and recording the age as of June 1st, or were they recording the age as of the date that the census was taken? It could make a difference. Let's take a closer look at 1850. Now, on the left-hand side, there are two columns. We'll zoom in a little bit, and we see a dwelling number and a family number. The dwelling number means just that. It's the number of the house or dwelling or apartment building, whatever that structure was that the enumerator stopped at. And it's just a sequential number. It is not the same as their street address. So in this particular record that we see here, it was the 616th dwelling that this particular enumerator had stopped at. Now the family number we see here is also sequential. It's often different than the dwelling number because it is very possible to have more than one family in one dwelling. And when you see that, the dwelling number won't change, but you'll see an additional listing for the family, so you can see the different family groups within that dwelling. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, that big improvement that we have in the census beginning in 1850, where we're listing everyone by name. We also have a description of the people living in this dwelling. We have their age, their sex, and their color. And in 1850, the census taker had three choices. They could list the person as white, black, or mulatto, which was often used to represent any sort of mixed race. It was not necessarily, for the purpose of the census, was not necessarily a percentage of one race or the other. It was just that there was a mixed race person living in this household. And it's not uncommon when you have an area that is predominantly one race or the other, that the census taker would leave most of the races blank and would only list the race for people who were not of the majority. So they would list the race only for minorities. Not unusual at all to see in the census in 1850. The next section that we have in the 1850 census is a section for occupation. And what's important to note for occupation is that they were only supposed to list it for males age 15 years and older. So as we see here, we don't have an occupation listed for Charlotte. She's female, so the census taker didn't have to record any occupation for her. It is very possible that she was working. She could have been a seamstress. She could have been working in a textile mill. She could have been doing any number of things. But the census taker only had to record the occupation of the males 15 and older. Then the next column is something else that we see for the first time in 1850, and that is a question about the value of the real estate owned. So this is going to reflect just the land and the buildings. It's not going to reflect, how much cattle they had or how many horses they owned. It's only going to be land and buildings. And it's also important to note that it's the value of the real estate that they owned. So if they were renting their house, nothing is going to be listed here. Another great improvement in the 1850 census is the place of birth. Now, it's not going to be very, very specific. They were only asked to list the state, the territory, or the country. So in this household, we see people who were born in Massachusetts and one person who was born in Ireland. So we don't have a specific birthplace for Catherine, born in Ireland, but it is giving us at least a little bit of information about her birthplace. Then in the next section, we have some questions about if this person was married within the year. And that means married within that census year. So the census date for 1850 was June the 1st. So were they married between June the 1st, 1849 and June the 1st, 1850? The same applies for the next question if they attended school within the year, from June 1st, 1849 to June 1st, 1850. And if the person was 20 or older and they couldn't read or write, they were supposed to mark that as well in the census. The last column in the 1850 census is something that seems kind of harsh. It's terms that we certainly wouldn't use today, but it was the terminology that was used at the time. And that's the last column in the 1850 census, where they're asking about disabilities. And specifically, they were supposed to mark if the person was deaf and dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, a pauper, or a convict. And they were actually supposed to spell this out. Obviously, they're not terms that we use today. We find them offensive today, but They were the terms that were being used at the time in 1850. And it's important to note that the the condition that is being reported could be caused by any number of things. Was there a head injury? It could have been epilepsy. It could have been Alzheimer's. It could have been any sort of mental illness. So it's very hard to pull out a family health history, specifically from the 1850 census, but it does give us a little bit more information about that person. And here's an example from the 1850 census where it is listing a person as deaf and dumb, as we see here. All right, moving on to 1860. Now, 1860 is almost identical to the 1850 census. One difference is that it included the value of personal property, and it asked the occupation for males and females 15 and older. So here we see in the 1860 census, we have the column not only for the value of the real estate, but also the value of what they call personal estate. So this is going to be reflecting of those horses that they owned, the cattle, any sort of personal property. So we see that this person is stating that he owned $300 worth of real estate and $1,002 worth of personal estate. Now, it's important to note, both in 1850 and here in 1860, where we're talking about the value of real estate and the value of personal property, that is very subjective. The census taker is just going to write down what the person told them. They're not actually going out and doing a valuation on the property. So it's very subjective. And this is an area where people may not have been exactly forthcoming, exactly truthful with the census taker, because a lot of people felt that it wasn't any of his business. So, sometimes they would just throw a number out, or they would just refuse to answer. Now, in 1870, we start to see even more detail than we saw in 1850 and 1860. So here in the personal description section, in the 1870 census, we have two more options for the census taker to reflect race. We have now added Chinese and Indian. And again, with the options that we had before for white, black, and mulatto. And in the 1870 census, we see the first time that they ask questions about the origins of the parents. And they're asking if the father was foreign-born or if the mother was foreign-born. And it doesn't list what country they were born in. It's just going to have a check mark if the person was born in some place other than the United States. So again, not a great deal of information, but it is a good clue to see if that person's either father and or mother were born in some place other than the United States. Then in the next section in the 1870 census, if the person had been born in the year, and again, we're talking about that census year, we're talking about the 12 months previous to the census. If they were born in that year, they were supposed to write down the month. And the same is true if the person had been married in that year. What month were they married? So that can be some very good information, especially if you're working in an area that wasn't keeping good vital records at this time. Here in the next section, talking about education, we again have a column to mark whether they attended school. But now we're getting a little bit more specificity about their literacy. Instead of could they read and write, it was split between cannot read and cannot write. Because they're finally realizing that just because you can read doesn't mean that you necessarily can write. So we're seeing a little bit more detail here in 1870. We lose a little bit of detail in the disability column. We have lost the question about if they were a pauper or a convict. but we're still seeing indications. We can still get information if they were deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. And then the last two columns deal with ability to vote. And the first column that we have here, column 19, is just a mark if the person was a male citizen 21 and over, which indirectly gives you a little bit of information about naturalization. If the person was male and they were over 21 and they were born in a foreign country, if this is checked, then it should mean that they were a naturalized citizen. If it wasn't checked, it should mean that they were not a naturalized U.S. citizen. So this is just asking about the citizenship of males 21 and over. And then the next column asks to mark those who cannot vote on grounds other than rebellion or crime. 1870, the first census after the Civil War. And you have the states in the South where most of the former Confederates were living. Their right to vote had been abridged, but if they could not vote based on that, they weren't supposed to be marked here. What column 20 is really asking is, are there other things that is keeping this person from voting other than being a former Confederate or having been convicted of a crime? What this is really asking is about those the voter laws that were put in place in many states after the Civil War. So that's what we're really looking at here in this last column, in column 20. Then in 1880, huge improvement in the U.S. Census. It's the first to list the relationship to the head of household. Now, we saw everyone listed by name in 1850, 1860, and 1870, but what we didn't have is how they were all related. We could make some good guesses, but 1880 is the first to actually spell it out. It's also the first to list the person's marital status. It's the first to list the birthplace of parents, regardless of where the parents were born. And it's the first census to list a street address, where the person actually had a street address. You usually don't find this in rural areas, but if your ancestors were living in an urban area where they did have named streets and the houses did have numbers, it actually should list the street address. So what we have in 1880 is what we've seen before in 1860, 70, and 80, where we have the dwelling number, we have the family number, we have the people listed by name, and that description with their race, their gender, and their age. But then we get to this wonderful column where it's listing everyone's relationship to the head of household. Wonderful information. Moving on a little bit further to the right in 1860, we have not only the occupation, but if that person had been unemployed for any number of months in the previous year, they were supposed to mark how many months they had been unemployed. So can give you a good clue, a good background about the context of this family. We also continue to see questions about disabilities. And here in that last section of the 1880 census, we get not only the person's birthplace, but their father's birthplace and their mother's birthplace. It's actually spelled out, and it's supposed to be recorded for everyone, regardless of where their parents were born. So great, great information here on the right-hand side of the 1880 census. All right, so next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to ask the question, an average family? Putting your ancestors in context. That will be next Wednesday, the 21st of August at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it's through the blog, liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, subscribing to our YouTube channel, which is a great way to see, you'll get a notification every time that we upload new videos. And next week, please make sure that you join us at the Federation of Genealogical Societies Conference in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We will be in the exhibit hall next Thursday through Friday, or Thursday through Saturday. We will be in the exhibit hall. We have booths 713 and 812 right there up front and center. Make sure that you come find us. We'd be happy to talk to you, happy to answer any questions that you might have about archives.com. In the meantime, again, stay connected with us at all these various places. And until next time, I'm Amy Johnson Crow, wishing you happy researching.